In this video, we'll talk about the framing effect. People tend to adopt the frame that is presented to them rather than restating the problem in their own way. What we see is all there is. But how a problem is framed can profoundly influence the decisions we made. By a frame, we refer to how a problem is presented to someone or how people represent or define a decision from their own perspective. The same decision can be thought of in terms of what is lost or what is gained, or in terms of what should I choose or what should I reject. Some leaders dismiss the framing effect as a matter of semantics. Good leaders capitalize on the framing effect. If we want to get buy-in for a new initiative, we'd better not to frame the initiative as a loss. Instead, we frame it as how people can gain from the initiative and how others have already benefited from it. Moreover, for a stronger effect, leaders can stoke fear and anxiety in people, framing the initiative as how we will lose if we don't do it. In this article, two psychologists, Kahneman and Tversky, reported their classic experiment that demonstrated the framing effect. Imagine that the U.S. is preparing for the outbreak of a disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. Two alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume that the exact scientific estimates of the consequence are as follows. If Program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. If Program B is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 probability that nobody will be saved. Which of the two programs would you prefer? Most of the people choose Program A. But now consider the second component of the problem, in which the same situation is given, but is followed by this description of the alternative programs. If Program C is adopted, 400 people will die. If Program D is adopted, there is 1/3 probability that nobody will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. Which of the two programs would you prefer? Most of the people choose Program D. Let's take a moment to look at the different choices in these two questions. Program A and C are identical, and so far for Program B and Program D. These are simply different descriptions of the same programs. The purely semantic shift in framing is sufficient to produce a different outcome. In another experiment on how framing changes decision-making, participants were more likely to approve administering a drug if they were told that the drug has 90% survival rate than 10% death rate. Rationally speaking, the 90% survival rate and 10% death rate provide the same evidence. But people respond differently to how the data are presented. The framing effect is associated with brain activity in the amygdala, which is the brain region associated with processing emotions, particularly negative emotions such as fear and anxiety. Therefore, when a problem is framed as loss versus gain, people respond more strongly to avoid losses. Leaders may seek personal gains at the expense of group interests. When leaders' personal interest is in conflict with group interest, how to turn a leader's my problem into a group's our problem? The framing effect is a tactic used by leaders to manipulate group preferences. When leaders privately benefit from starting a war against another country, such as pursuing the leader's own ideology, building political capital, or financial gains from arms deals, one powerful strategy is to frame the war as defensive rather than offensive aggression. This war as a defense framing makes my problem our problem. Generally, people are more inclined to support defensive as opposed to offensive wars. After all, who would argue against self-defense? In education, we've been using high needs to label schools and communities. We've been using at risk to label students. How would you feel if you are labeled as a high needs, at risk human being? I would get very defensive. Another example of framing in education is how we frame differences of educational outcomes. Many people called it achievement gap. Some scholars argue that the term achievement gap promotes deficit-based mindsets, negative stereotypes about students of color, and downplays the role that broader social structural forces play in producing student performance outcomes. Some scholars suggest using the term education debt to highlight the way in which students of color have been systematically disadvantaged in education throughout the country's history. Other scholars suggest the term opportunity gap. Education Week reported the results of a national survey of more than 15,000 teachers about how they talked about the differences in educational outcomes. 49% of teachers used achievement gap to describe differences in educational outcomes of black and white students, whereas only 31% of teachers used opportunity gap. 44% of teachers use the achievement gap to describe differences in educational outcomes of Hispanic and white students, whereas only 34% of teachers use opportunity gap. Among teachers who used achievement gap, 27% of teachers believed society bears more responsibility than individuals for the different educational outcomes of black and white students. However, among teachers who use opportunity gap, 43% of teachers believed society bears more responsibility than individuals. In this video, we talked about the framing effect. People tend to adopt the frame as it is presented to them rather than restating the problem in their own way. What we see is all there is. Now it is time for you to provide an example of the framing effect and reflect on how it influences decisions made by you or the people around you.